All right, we're continuing with our study of Jacob. Last class, I think I just gave you some introductory material on Jacob. I told you the meaning of his two names. He's named Jacob at birth, and he was named Israel when he was 91. When he came back into the land. Jacob comes from a word that means heel, or footprint, or hinder part. And his name actually means supplanter. And he was given that name as a result of what he did when he was born. He grabbed his brother's heel on the way out. In the Hebrew lexicon, his name is Yaakov, and then his name therefore comes from Akov or Akav, which in turn comes from another verb that means to follow at the heel. So you can trace them through to find their names. Okay? Israel, on the other hand, means God persists or perseveres. Or let God contend. And he was given that name when he was on his way back into the land of Canaan after he had wandered for many years of his life out of fellowship with God. And he was fighting with the angel. And he must have been a fairly tenacious dude, because God renamed him at that particular point. Now, I think I gave you some stuff on Chronology of Jacob. I'll just review some of that because I've just reworked it, and there may be some new points for you to add in, or in your chronology. Every time I've studied these patriarchs, I've always learned something new, and so these are facts that you should incorporate in your story. Talk about original Bible study. This is what makes it exciting. Okay? If you're going to tell a story, make it exciting for your kids. Jacob was born when his dad was 60 and his grandfather 160. And I'll give you the references for these if you'd like. You should double check them so you understand it. Genesis 25:26. Jacob was 15 years old when his grandfather Isaac died. Genesis 25:8. When he was 40 years old, his twin brother Esau married two Canaanite girls. How old was Esau? Yeah, his twin brother. So his brother got married when he was 40, and you'll see that Jacob remained unmarried for a number of years, quite a few years, in fact. Genesis 26:34 tells us that Esau was married at 40. 23 years after this, when Jacob and Esau were 63 years old, their great uncle Ishmael died. Genesis 25:17. Eight years after that, Jacob fled to Padan Aram, or Syria, at the age of 71 years, still unmarried. I think I told you 60 or 70. Yeah. Okay, well, I've reworked it, and I can prove to you that he was 71 when he left. Yeah. You have to work backwards from this point. The only way you can tell some of these dates now is to go from the time that he was standing in front of Pharaoh. He was 130 when he stood before Pharaoh, so you have to work backwards. We know that his son Joseph was in jail for so many years. We know how old he was when Joseph was born up in Syria. So you can work backwards from that. If Joseph was the 11th son and he had been there 20 years, then you know how old he was when he went into the land of Syria. Okay? You have to work backwards from those dates. So that's how you come up with this stuff. The references for him being 71 when he got married after he left home is Genesis 27:43 and 28 verses 6 to 7. Most of the stories you picture him, he's about 30 years old when he goes up there, right? And I worked it out. Philip was saying, well, he did live till he was 147 years of age. If you compare the 70-year lifespan of an average person today to a man who lived 150 years old back then, when Jacob left home, it was like leaving home at 34 years of age. He was still, most people get married in their 20s, and he still was getting married later in life, but he was about the age of a 34-year-old man today when he left home. Okay?
If you figured there was age for age, that's kind of reduction. But the father had not been married.
Yeah.
And what happened when you said that?
Tell him what happened when he was 71. He left home, running for his life.
That'd be a year of blessing.
Padan-aram or Syria. And we know that he wasn't married because when he got up there, he met this pretty girl at the well and wooed her and got her sister. They lived by the sword, died by the sword.
He was 71 when he left.
He was 71 when he left home, and I don't think it took him 5 years to get up to Syria. You can picture the story that he got up there within just a couple of months, probably, or even weeks. No, that was years later. And it seems as if in the story, when you go from Genesis 27 to 28 to 29, he left when he was in chapter 28, and 29 says that he was married. So I don't think that there's nothing in the text that indicates that it was a long period of time. So we'll assume that it happened the same year he left. Over the next 20 years, Jacob married Leah first, then he got Rachel, and he was given 2 concubines. They actually became his wives, legally. He begot 11 sons and a daughter, and became extremely wealthy, working for his father-in-law Laban, who happened to be his uncle. Genesis 31:38. I'll read that verse. It's a significant verse. When he was leaving Syria, this is what he said to Laban. This 20 years have I been with you. Your ewes and your she-goats have not cast their young. The rams of your flock have I not eaten. I'll read down to verse 42. That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto you. I bore the loss of it. Of my hand did you require it, neither whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was. In the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from mine eyes. Thus have I been 20 years in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your cattle. And you have changed my wages 10 times. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me. Surely you had sent me away now empty. God hath seen mine affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked you last night. And this is when Laban finally caught up to him when he was running. He ran away when he went to Syria, and he ran away when he left Syria. It doesn't pay to go into the world. You'll be running. And so over the next 20 years, Jacob got his wives and begot 11 sons and a daughter. This is before Benjamin was born. Benjamin wasn't born up in Syria. He was born in Bethlehem. And so over the next 20 years, we find him getting married and getting wealthy. Joseph, Jacob's last son, was born in Syria when Jacob was 91 years of age. If he was 71 when he went up there, and if Joseph was born the year he left, that makes him how old? 91. I'll just read that. Back in chapter 30, verses 22 to 26. God remembered Rachel. This is when Jacob is still living up in Padan Aram. And finally, God hearkened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived, and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. She was expecting that God would bless her with yet another son. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away. You see that? Immediately. Almost immediately after Joseph, his 11th son, was born, this is when he made up his mind he wanted to leave Syria. So how old does that make Joseph when he runs away, and it takes him 10 days to get down to a place called Jabbok, the Jabbok River on the eastern side of the Jordan. It runs from the wilderness into the Jordan River. That's also called Mahanaim. It's also called Peniel. How old is Joseph when Jacob comes home? He's just a newborn. Right? Now, that isn't the end of the story, because it seems as if Jacob settled for a little while in chapters 33 and 34 in central Palestine up in a place called Shechem, and he built a house there, it says, and he stayed there for a while, but then his sons killed a bunch of people there to spite the rape of their daughter, of their sister rather, and by one of the local people. And so Jacob was forced to move because it was pretty tough living there where everybody hated him now. So he left. And all that probably took a period of months. And so Joseph was probably 1 or 2 years old when his brother Benjamin, 1 or 2 at the most, probably still he was 1 year old when his brother Benjamin was born, and at which time his mother died. So it puts the whole story in a little bit different perspective. So his father Jacob is 91 when he leaves Syria just after Joseph is born. That's Genesis 41, 46, and 45:6. Yeah, 41, 46, and 45:6.
That's when Joseph was born and when he left.
Yeah. Well, let me see. That doesn't seem right.
You gave another reference at 22, 26.
Yeah, that's the better reference. You should actually put Genesis 30, verses 22 to 26.
You see pictures of when they bring Benjamin to in front of
Pharaoh? Joseph.
And he's always way younger than Joseph.
Yeah. Well, in reality, he was just a year younger. Yeah. All right. When Jacob was 108 years old, his son Joseph was sold into slavery. Now we have to go to chapter 37, verse 2 for this information. Jacob dwelt in the land when he came back into Palestine. where his father was a sojourner in the land of Canaan. By the way, where did Isaac live most of his life? He started out in Philistine country. Excuse me. He started out in a place called Lahai-Rai, and then Isaac moved to a place called, and he died in a place where Abraham was buried. Where is that? Famous town, Hebron. Okay. Well, it says that Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a sojourner in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. They weren't merely concubines, they were actually his wives. And Joseph brought to his father their evil report. And so we find that Jacob lives for a number of years with his father Isaac. His wife has died. Isaac's wife has probably died. So we have the two patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob, living if not in the same house, at least in the same area, and they're raising all of these 12 boys, or 12 boys and this one daughter. Okay? I don't know whatever happened to Dinah. So when he was 108, this is 17 years later, after he came into the land, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. This is about 15 or 16 years after Benjamin was born and Rachel died. So I gave you Genesis 37:2 and also 35:19. 35:19 says that Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. Then it says in verse 27 that Jacob came to Isaac his father to Mamre unto the city of Arbah, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. Right? So those references show us that he came home to his father when he was 91, approximately 91 or 92, and he stayed there for 17 years before his sins caught up to him and his family all fell apart. 12 years later, Jacob lost his father, Isaac. Yes, Jacob was 120 years old when his father Isaac died at 160. That's Genesis 35:28. The days of Isaac were 180 years. The next year, unbeknownst to Jacob, you remember by this time Jacob thought that Joseph was dead. All right? The year before he had been sold into slavery when he was 17. And Jacob thought he was dead. Well, he had no idea, but the next year, Joseph was installed on the throne. That can't be right. I don't think that's right. I'm going to put a question mark beside that. The next year, unbeknownst to Jacob. Oh yes, that's right. This is 12 years after he was sold into slavery. And then the 13th year, Joseph was installed on the throne of Egypt. Yeah, he was 30 years old when he was installed on the throne of Egypt.
Yes, that's David's right.
And Jacob was 121 years old at that time. The reference is chapter 41, verse 46. Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. All right? So we know that Joseph, for a matter of fact, was 30 when he was exalted to the throne, and he had been a servant at Potiphar's house for a number of years, and he had been in jail for at least 2 in federal prison. So there's a period of 12 or 13 years there between when he was 17 and when he stood on the throne. What did he do during that time? If you go to Genesis, these chapters on Joseph's life, which we'll pick up with later, it appears as if he spent all that time either as a slave or in jail on trumped-up charges. All right, so Jacob is now 121 years old. He doesn't know that his son has been exalted to the throne of Egypt. And 22 years after he thought Joseph died, 22 years after Jacob thought that Joseph had died, God restored him to his son when he was 130 years of age. Genesis chapter 47, verse 9. This is the end of the story where Jacob is brought down in to the land. He stands before Pharaoh, and this is what he said. Jacob said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the land of their pilgrimage. So these facts, when you read them through, sometimes they don't dawn on you how significant they are. But because we are given these scattered references at significant times, we are able to piece together the story in quite a bit of detail. It was 22 years between when Joseph was sold into slavery and when his father stood before Pharaoh at 130 years of age. It tells us in chapter 47 that there were yet 5 years of famine at the point in which Jacob came into the land. There were still 5 years of famine. And so the last 12 of the 17 years that Jacob spent in Egypt until he died at 147, the last dozen years of his life he lived in luxury in Goshen, fully blessed and restored by God. Genesis 47, 27 and 28. Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob himself lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. He was 130 when he went down. See? Add 17 makes him 147. And it says, so the whole age of Jacob was 147 years, and he died. So if there were 5 years of famine, yet... See, he came down in the second year of the 7 years of famine, and so the last 17 years of life were good years for Jacob. And so, if we summarize these facts, we can come up with 4 periods in Jacob's life, and I think you ought to summarize this. This is really the essence of it. When you look at all these facts together, you find that he spent the first 71 years of his life at home in Canaan, probably in Hebron. This first half of his life, 171 years, is recorded in 2 chapters, in chapters 25 and 27 in the book of Genesis. Very little information is given to us of this period of his life. The next 20 years of his life were spent in self-imposed exile, as it were, in the world, in Syria. And even though this was only a mere 20 years of his life, I wish you'd make a note of this, that there are 6 chapters in Genesis, from chapters 28 to 33. There are 6 chapters devoted to detailing for us the information that occurred, the significant events. It was here that he sowed his seeds, 28 to 33. He sowed his seeds in the world. Most people don't ever see this about Jacob's life, but this is really a picture of a person that gets out of fellowship with God. He goes into the world, And he spends some time there. And the Bible says you always reap what you sow. And we don't see him reaping here, we see him sowing. Right? The next 39 years of his life is where he reaped. Because the next 39 years of his life, he's back in Hebron for the most part. I mean, he spends probably about a year up in Shechem, and then he comes to Bethel and builds an altar, but then he moves to Hebron. The next 39 years of his life are spent in Hebron again, at home with his dad, until his dad dies. And it's here that he begins to reap what he's sown. His daughter gets into a fix with some guy, some Canaanite lord. His own sons go out there and breach their promises to these people and kill a bunch of them, ruin Jacob's testimony, his reputation. He has to move. His own sons become such wonderful, loving brothers that they sell their youngest brother or their second youngest brother. They hated one another. And there was all kinds of strife and turmoil. He lived for years. This is the low part of Jacob's life, those 39 years. Pretty tough. There are 7 chapters that describe for us the fruits of his sin. Chapters 34 and 35. Chapter 37. And chapters 42 to 45. But then all is not lost, because Jacob is a genuine believer, because he has been chosen by God to be blessed. God does allow him the last 17 years of his life to be blessed in Egypt. Now this time God worked it out so that he wasn't in the land. This was intended by God for a blessing. Egypt usually is a representation of the world in Scripture, but in this case it was a place of salvation. So the last 17 years of his life, the fourth major period, we have 5 chapters devoted to it in chapters 46 to 50. I once heard a preacher down in Hamilton preach a message on the life of Joseph, and he used L's to alliterate the major activities of Joseph's life, and it was such an effective sermon that I could still remember today several of those L's. And so I've always done that. Whenever I make notes on Jacob, I've always put those L's. We find him in the first 71 years of his life longing for his brother's birthright, longing for the blessings that his brother was going to get because he was the firstborn. We see him lying to his dad. So he is longing and lying. In that 20-year period when he's up in Syria, we see him leaving home. We see him loving his wives. We see him loafing. Now, loafing in the spiritual sense, he was pretty busy, making babies and making money. But spiritually, he was loafing, right? He was leaving home, he was loving his wives, and he was loafing spiritually. He was limping when he came back into the land because the angel touched the sinew of his thigh, and he limped from that point on in his life. Yeah. The 39 years that he spent back at home in Hebron, we find him losing his reputation. We find him losing his family. We find him landing finally at home, back in fellowship with God. We have him living out the results of his fleshly decisions or seeds that he's sown. And of course, the last 17 years of his life, we find Jacob luxuriating in God's blessings. Luxuriating, Luxuriating. 18.
Never been able to experience it, so I've never been able to.
Sure.
Yeah, most of the other
Yeah.
How come that's me for 172? Why are you 170 there?
No, 147.
Oh.
27, 28. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, and the whole life of Jacob was 147 years. Okay? Now, before we leave Jacob this morning, I would like to focus on what I consider to be the dominant theme of Jacob's life, or personality. The dominant theme of Jacob's personality. This just came to me again this weekend as I was preaching on this and studying. It finally dawned on me what the one thing that is characteristic of Jacob. Abraham, if you compare Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, the dominant thing was a man of faith. Okay? He was a father of high distinction, the father of faith, the father of the Jews. His fatherhood and his faith are the dominant themes in Abraham's life. Isaac, the dominant thing about Isaac is that he was a submissive, cooperative, obedient son. Right? A yielded and submissive person. And we find very few real traumas in Isaac's life. Life was lived on a pretty even scale for poor old Isaac, even though he lived the last 50 years of his life blind. Because he stayed with one woman, and he was faithful to her, and he was submissive to Abraham, his father's will. He reaped in his own life a very placid existence. Peace. Very different from Jacob, his son. Jacob, now this guy was like his mother. Unlike his father, this guy was a strong-willed child. Even before he was born, he was grabbing his brother's heel. I want you. I want what you've got. And this is what we see. The 71 years in the first period of his life, he is conniving, he's deceiving, he's lying, he's working with his mother. I'm sure his mother kind of had a great molding influence on a formative influence on Jacob's character in this way. She was the one that was instigating him to go to his father. He seemed a little reticent at first, but he did do it, and it was perfectly consistent with his character that he was tenaciously desirous of what his brother had. He wanted he wanted Esau's birthright, and he wanted Esau's blessing, and he wasn't going to say no. He was going to take no for that. If he had to, what's the financial word for connive to get it? If he had to extort it out of him, he would get the birthright. Yes, see, and if he had to lie and deceive to get it from his father, he was willing to do that too. We find what we are evidencing here is a man with a strong personality, a strong will. And so he leaves home when he's 71 years of age, and we find him willfully doing what he wishes to do for the next 20 years. A very tenacious will. He fights against Laban. He says, I'm not happy with this woman, I want the other one. And so he was willing to even spend another 7 of those years of his life working like a dog to pay for his other wife, Rachel, the one that he really wanted. And when he got her, he didn't live with Leah, he lived with Rachel. He knew what he wanted. He was the kind of guy that just had evidenced a strong will. And then when he come back into the land, and when God broke his will, sort of, he remained a strong-willed person. Remember, he was fighting with the angel, and he repented. He finally confessed that he was who he was like, and he acknowledged his willful ways. And then that night he was fighting with the angel, and he said, I will not let you go until I get a blessing. You see it coming out again. Tenacious will. That strong desire to have his way. I want a blessing. I'm going to fight you to the death if I have to get it. With an angel, no less.
Apparently those angels,
whether there was...
touched them enough of it.
Yeah. Well, and it specifically says there in Genesis chapter 33 that because you're a prince because you have contended with God, like you fought for it. You know? And so this is the dominant characteristic of Jacob's life. Strong-willed person. Of course, when it was governed by the flesh, his will got him into trouble, and he reaped many problems in his life because of it. But when he finally submitted to the Lord's will and repented, when he was 91 years of age, it was a real turnaround. He was given a new name, and he lived in peace and in fellowship, renewed fellowship with his own father. And at the end of his life, he was blessed because he submitted to the Lord's will. And it's at the end of his life that you see his faith. While he was in that significant verse that I read in chapter 31, was it 32, where he's talking to Laban? Yes, in 31. He's not a man of faith during that period of time. But he does allude to it. He says, except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, had been with me, and except the fear of my father Isaac had been with me. So he doesn't have enough nerve to tell Laban that he was a God-fearing man himself, but he says, I know what my father believed.
I don't think he was threatening Laban with his father.
No, I don't think he was threatening him. He's simply telling Laban that the only thing that has helped him survive this 20 years of deceit that Laban has laid on him. I mean, Laban really abused him. He was a hard-working man. In spite of his character as a deceiver, he was honest with Laban. He had taken the brunt of all the problems that Laban had economically. And he had kept his word. He had worked for 14 years for those two girls. He could have taken off earlier, but he kept his promises. And we find that it wasn't his own faith that kept him. It was the faith that he knew his father had. What a picture. There's a real lesson there for parents. If your kids ever go away into the world, contrary to your advice and training as a godly parent, the one thing that will probably bring them back is the fact that they will observe true faith in your own experience as a parent. And that was very evident in Isaac and Jacob's life. Really an interesting point. So Jacob then, the dominant idea is this man that was a strong